Now we can move along into, as I said, the bulk of session 2, which will be by our 4 panelists. I will take the time to introduce every single one of them before calling up our first speaker. Our panel is comprised of, firstly, Dr. Victoria Nalule. She's a research fellow with the DFID-funded Extractives Hub project based at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral Law and Policy. She's the holder of a PhD in International Energy Law and Policy from the CPMLP. She is the founder and executive director of the African Energy and Minerals Management Initiative. She will be addressing the topic, what does the energy transition mean in the African context, and introducing the energy progression dialogue as a way to utilize fossil fuels for future development in Africa. Our second speaker that will also be on this panel will be Ms. Tatiana Bao Lopez. She is an oil and gas lawyer with an LLM in energy law by the universities Oslo, Aberdeen, Groningen, and Copenhagen. She's the founder and managing partner at TPLA, a boutique law firm focused in assisting the development of energy and infrastructure projects in Mozambique. She has strong expertise in local content, and universal access to energy is a strong area of focus for her. She will be discussing the role of natural gas in tackling energy access challenges in the energy transition era, specifically focused on Mozambique. Our third panelist will be Professor Peter Cameron. Professor Peter Cameron is one of the world's leading authorities on energy law. He's currently a professor of international energy law and the director at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral Law and Policy at the University of Dundee. He's a barrister and sits as an arbitrator in exit proceedings. He's also a published author in international investment law, as well as in mining, oil, and gas. He will be addressing what the legal implications of the energy transitions are and the COVID pandemic, or rather, the legal implications of the energy transitions and the COVID pandemic on petroleum investments in Africa. Our fourth and final panelist will be Dr. Carol Nakle. She's the founder and CEO of Crystal Energy, an advisory, research, and training firm awarded the Best Independent Energy Consultancy in the UK in the year 2018. She also lectures at universities in the UK, in Italy, in Lebanon, and in Naples, and she has worked on energy projects in more than 45 countries. What she will be bringing forward for us is what are the economic implications of the energy transitions on Africa's oil and gas producers. So those are our 4 very highly qualified panelists for today. I would also like to encourage, or rather remind, the ladies and gentlemen in attendance that they can and are encouraged to ask questions in the chat box, which will be addressed at the end of the session in a Q&A, as well as any of the speakers who feel comfortable addressing questions directly in the chat box may go ahead and do so. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to call up our first speaker, Dr. Victoria Nalule, to set the tone.
Thank you very much, Zach. So in my presentation today, I want to give a brief about the global outlook on energy transitions and how this outlook is likely to affect African countries, especially with respect to tackling energy poverty and energy access challenges on the African continent. And as I'm addressing this issue, I would like to suggest a new term or a new concept, which I believe is the appropriate concept to use with respect to the African continent, and that is the concept of energy progression, which I'm introducing for the first time. So as I've been introduced, a research fellow with the DFID Extractive Hub project, and I'm also leading research on energy transitions, specifically in Africa. And I'm also the executive director of the African Energy and Mineral Management Initiative. And luckily enough, we have just concluded a book project which focuses on energy transitions and their impact on the African continent. And the book will be launched after this session, so you should look forward to that. And it has brilliant contributions from different African experts. So this is a topic which is really very important, because if we are not able to get the key concepts very well, that means that African countries will not likely to benefit from our energy resources. So my research is mostly focused on the African energy and mining sectors. I have 3 books so far, and I have another one upcoming. So if you want to get copies of my books, please feel free to email me. I'll give you a free copy by email, soft copy. So feel free if you want to get a copy. In summary, because the previous panelists have actually handled the issue of energy access and also issues we're facing in Africa very well with respect to energy challenges. So I'll not dwell too much on energy access challenges. I'll just talk about them briefly, but then I'll emphasize on the need as to why in Africa we should focus on energy progression rather than energy transition, and why this is important for us to keep attracting the necessary investments in the fossil fuel sector. So with the hub research, we're also concluding our research on energy transition indicators. So if you've registered and we have your emails, be well assured that we will be sharing with you more research with respect to energy transitions and some of our noble and key aspects and concepts we are developing with respect to this subject. So for us to understand why it's important to tackle the issue of energy transition and to also change the global outlook of how this issue has been displayed internationally and how African countries are being forced to respond to this issue, we have to appreciate the energy challenge, the energy challenges we face on the African countries, on the African continent. So with energy access, we know Goal 7 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals emphasizes access to modern energy for all people. And with this, we have to be aware of affordability. Can people actually afford the energy resources? Can they access it? Is it reliable? And also recently, the issue of sustainability. So we all know that energy is very key in addressing the major global challenges we face, including famine, poverty, gender inequality, and also Goal 7 is very key in achieving all the other sustainable development goals, including the goal for on education, healthy living, because currently we are being faced with the COVID-19 pandemic. But on the African continent, we've been lucky so far that we haven't really been so much impacted by this pandemic. But given the health situations we have and the energy challenges we have on the continent, the question would arise, do we have enough modern energy resources in case this pandemic spreads? Do we have enough modern energy resources for us to respond? Can the healthcare system and the healthcare sector, can they respond adequately to the challenge? So you realize that energy is really key in addressing all the global challenges we face internationally, but also on the African continent. Now, why is it very important for African countries to be able to respond uniquely to the challenges of energy transition? We know over 600 million people lack access, and I've been following, I really followed the presentation by Dr. Kopschenge, where he illustrated a lot with respect to the issue of energy access. So I'll not waste a lot of time on this, but we have to be aware that the challenge of energy access is going to escalate on the African continent. It's anticipated to escalate because first and foremost, by 2040, we are expecting more urbanization, where estimations show that over 2 billion people are likely to be living in urban centers. With urbanization comes the need to have access to modern energy. With urbanization comes the need for industrialization. And not to mention the fact that the population growth is also estimated to increase by around 1.7 billion to reach nearly 9.2 billion people in 2040. And Africa is at the center of this population growth. But if right now we have over 600 million people without access to modern energy. So what will happen with the anticipated urbanization and population growth? So these questions are very key for us to be able to respond to global discussions with respect to energy transition. And luckily today, I had a chance to read a recent article on energy transitions by some big organization, which I will not mention. And the author was reacting to the initiatives that are still being taken in developing countries to develop their fossil fuels. And the author, in the author's view, he felt like African countries or developing countries should now concentrate more on renewable energy resources, which is not a bad thing because we are aware of climate change challenges. But what about the population growth? What about the urbanization? How will we be able to benefit from all these if the international community and global experts are mostly focused on the issue of energy transition? So those are some of the questions we really need to ask ourselves. And we also have to find ways of how we can redefine some of these global concepts to make sure that they fit in an African perspective so that our people, because I know like over 70% of people in rural areas, they still use traditional energy. They still use firewood for cooking, charcoal for cooking, candles for lighting. So that means that we have to utilize all the energy resources we have on the continent, including fossil fuels, to be able to tackle these challenges. So having highlighted that, I would also like to note that in most cases, people think like people who have no access to modern energy, they're the people who are poor and they cannot afford it, because that's more to do with an issue of affordability. But however, recent research shows that even for people who can afford, who actually have the money and they would like to move towards modern energy, they are facing accessibility issues. And in this graph, you're seeing in blue, these are the people who are above the poverty line. So they're above the poverty line, but still they lack access to modern energy. And then the people in yellow, they are below the poverty line, and it's understandable as to why they would still be using traditional energy, including firewood and charcoal for cooking. But then the issue of accessibility is very key because it points to the fact that we need to establish mini energy infrastructure on the African continent to ensure that people actually do have access, those who can afford to have access. And also, besides accessibility, we have to ensure that modern energy is affordable. Now, looking towards the future, like I mentioned, we're expecting a boom in urbanization. We're expecting a boom in population growth. And we're seeing these key sectors which will play a major role on the African continent, including the industry and also transport, and then buildings. This relates more to urbanization. So on the African continent, most countries are moving to, like we're expecting a lot of industrialization. Renewable energy sources, yes, they are good, but are they adequate enough to take us through industrialization? And I think in most cases, what researchers and maybe policymakers and the global community, what we miss out is we tend to forget the history. Because if you go back to history, you will notice that a few decades back, there was a coal panic in the UK, whereby they had to take drastic measures to ensure that they have enough coal to enable them go through the Industrial Revolution. So what is the case for African countries? Should we say goodbye to these fossil fuels, and yet we're expecting more energy demand in the transport sector, in the industry, and also buildings by 2040? So it's with respect to these questions that we have to rethink the concept of energy transition. We have to rethink it in that we have to be able to address the global energy challenges we face without countries or policymakers or even politicians feeling guilty of utilizing the available fossil fuels they have on the continent. So with transition, the reason as to why we really have to rethink, we have to get the best understanding of these terms. Transition mostly connects to changing from one state or condition to another. So with this definition of a transition, it's more of you have to shift whether you like it or not. You have to shift from fossil fuels, you have to go to renewables, but how are we addressing the impact this transition is likely to have socially and economically on the people, especially in developing countries? So those are some of the questions we really have to ask ourselves, because globally, internationally, we're seeing a decline in investments in fossil fuels. We're seeing many international initiatives and energy policies focusing on energy transitions, but we as Africans or African policymakers, do you really have a say on this, or are we just going to go with that transition without really thinking of the negative impact it's likely to have on the economy and also on our people? So I would like to highlight the problems we have globally and the reason as to why we tend to focus on things that shouldn't really matter and we leave out things that don't matter. So there is this aspect called the streetlight effect. And I will not go into detail about the streetlight effect, but in summary, it's a situation where people and governments or international organizations tend to focus on an aspect which is in the limelight. And currently, it's more on climate change and energy transitions. So you notice that they would leave behind some of the key aspects that have to be addressed and focus on these few aspects which they believe, if I'm to write about energy transitions, if I'm to ask people to shift immediately to renewables without putting into consideration the impact this might have, then I get the funding. So that's the streetlight effect. You do this, then you get the funding, you get the attention, you get everything. But we have to ask ourselves questions as, what does this transition likely to, how is it likely to affect people socially and economically? Because like I mentioned, we're expecting a booming urbanization, population growth, and industrialization. How are we able to address all this? So that's something we need to really put into consideration. And we need to redefine and rethink some of the concepts we're using, because they do have an impact on the investment flows on the African continent. They have an impact socially and also economically. So in this respect, I would like to introduce the concept of energy progression. So progression, simply put, means moving gradually towards a more advanced state. Like I mentioned a few decades back, the UK and most EU countries experienced the coal panic. Now, why do we need progression on the African continent? This will give us time to utilize whatever energy resources we have. Because with progression, you notice that people in rural areas face different energy challenges than those in urban areas. People in developing countries face different energy challenges than those in developed countries. And each country or each area should progress at its own pace. And this means that even international initiatives and government policies have to recognize this progress, because you cannot just move, you cannot just transition. No, if we do that, we're going to be affected entirely. And if we don't take action now, it will reach a time whereby when a country puts up some policies to develop their fossil fuels, they will be criticized by, like the recent report I read from some international organization. They will be criticized. And that shouldn't be the case. We should be able to develop and progress from one energy source to another without feeling guilty because we do need this for our urbanization, industrialization, and also to cater for the population growth that is expected to rise on the continent. So why is this issue important of distinguishing between energy transition and energy progression? Like I mentioned, it will allow countries, companies, and also governments to finance their fossil fuel projects without feeling guilty. Yes, we have to tackle climate change, but with progression, we can think about cleaner energy technologies that can enable us to still progress from firewood for rural areas to maybe fossil fuels. And then later, when we're ready, we can embrace more renewable energies. But this does not in any way mean that African countries are climate change deniers. Like in the book project we want to be launching, you see there are already different initiatives to deploy renewable energy sources on the African continent. We have different initiatives to address energy access challenges like the USAID Power Africa, the Sustainable Energy for All. We also have regional responses on the African countries, and including power pools, infrastructure developments. So there are already initiatives to deploy renewable energy and also embrace energy efficiency technologies, but this should not be at the detriment of utilizing the fossil fuel resources we have. So in this respect, we should expect, or we should not shy away from initiatives that are focused on progression, including ensuring more investments in fossil fuel infrastructure developments. Like Mr. Kasande mentioned, in Uganda, they are moving towards constructing a refinery, because it's a bit upsetting that the African continent is a home to oil and gas resources, but we have the least oil refineries in the world, or in the world. So it's a bit upsetting, and with the current global move, even governments or even financiers and international financial institutions, they're shying away from investing or making finances available for African countries to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure developments, but that shouldn't be the case. So if we embrace energy progression and we accept that each country should be given a chance to progress their own terms, then that means that international initiatives, regional initiatives, and even governments, policymakers, they will not feel guilty for embracing fossil fuel developments for their economic development. So,
Doctor.
Yes.
Doctor, if I may, I have a question, which is essentially just what remarks would you like to leave the audience with to kind of tie together the whole of your presentation?
Thank you very much. That means I have to wrap up. So in wrapping up, I would like to share with you some of the initiatives that have been going on the African continent to tackle energy access challenges, including this map of the West African gas pipeline project, which is a good thing because estimates show that the gas that is being flared in West Africa is capable of electrifying the entire ECOWAS region. And also we have to focus on region initiatives, including setting up region energy infrastructure, but also harmonizing our energy laws. So in conclusion, do check out my YouTube channel. I've done several videos on the sector, mining sector and energy sector. And also feel free to reach out if you need more research from my side. Thank you very much, Zach.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for that insightful presentation and introducing us to the energy progression